There is a particular kind of individual who has spent their entire existence bearing a weight they never consciously agreed to carry. It is not the burden of failure, nor is it even the weight of grief and loss. It is something far quieter, something that commenced so early in their development that they no longer possess any memory of a self existing prior to its arrival. It is the weight of what everyone else anticipated they would become. A parent's unuttered ambition, a teacher's passing observation that imperceptibly solidified into an inescapable verdict, or a family's desperate requirement for someone to serve as the reliable anchor, the successful offspring, the one who finally achieves enough so that the anxiety carried by the collective unit can at long last be deposited onto a fresh set of shoulders. And so it was deposited onto yours. You did not choose this assignment. No one sits a child down and requests their informed consent to become the vessel for the unfulfilled longings of previous generations. It occurs through minute increments in the silent space between what is spoken aloud and what is implied. It is witnessed in a sudden flash of parental pride that appears only when you secure an achievement, or a chilling silence that descends only when you stumble. You learned, far earlier than a child ever should, that affection within your domestic sphere arrived with hidden clauses attached, even if no member of the household ever dared to pronounce the word condition. That silence communicated a far more potent doctrine than any overt lecture could ever deliver. You developed an acute fluency in reading the subtle emotional climate of a room long before you acquired the ability to read the terrain of your own inner world. You knew precisely what manner of presence you were required to project at the family dinner table within the classroom, and before relatives who constantly measured your trajectory against cousins you had never asked to compete against. You began performing competence long before you possessed any personal comprehension of what competence meant to you as an individual, separate from what it signified to the onlookers evaluating your life. This behavior is not genuine ambition. It is psychological architecture. Throughout my decades of clinical work and research into the human mind, I have examined what I term the persona, the complex mask an individual constructs to meet the relentless demands and expectations of the outside world. The persona is not inherently deceitful or malicious. It is a necessary structural adaptation, a functional social skin that permits a human being to navigate society without remaining in a state of continuous psychological exposure. Yet I have issued a very specific warning regarding this mechanism, a danger that most individuals fail to comprehend until the ultimate emotional cost has already been exacted. The danger does not reside in the act of wearing the mask. The danger lies in forgetting that a genuine face ever existed beneath it. You constructed your persona remarkably early, and you constructed it with exceptional skill. It was praised, rewarded, and reinforced at every milestone, because it represented the exact structural artifact everyone around you required. You became the high achiever, the dependable presence, the individual who never generates complications, who quietly absorbs expectations without complaint, and without ever inquiring what the maintenance of such a facade costs. No one inquired about the cost, because the mask functioned so flawlessly that eventually even you ceased to remember that it was merely an artificial apparatus. There exists a very specific form of soul weariness that does not stem from physical exertion or overwork. It emerges from performing the correct societal actions for the wrong psychological reasons over such an extended duration that you lose the perceptual capacity to distinguish between your authentic desires and the desires that were installed within your psyche before you were old enough to object. You pursue milestones and experience a profound numbness upon reaching them. You receive public validation and feel a strange, hollow void beneath it, precisely because the validation was always directed at the mask, never at whatever fragile truth remains hidden underneath. That persistent hollowness is not a defect within your character. It is diagnostic information. It is that neglected segment of your psyche that has been attempting, quietly and over many years, to inform you that the life you are currently building was not designed by your own inner authority. That internal voice does not simply evaporate because you choose to ignore it. It waits. It accumulates a weight of its own, a secondary burden accruing silently beneath the primary one, until one day, without prior warning, its resonance grows so pronounced that it can no longer be suppressed. When this inner voice finally breaks through, the moment rarely announces itself as a dramatic catastrophe. It frequently arrives disguised as a minor, disconcerting anomaly. It manifests as the long-sought promotion achieved after years of grueling labor, followed immediately by an unsettling sense of emptiness. It appears as a relationship that receives complete societal approval, accompanied by a quiet dread when you project yourself living inside its parameters for the next 4 decades. It presents itself as a significant life milestone that ought to have felt like a triumphant arrival, but instead feels like standing in an unfamiliar room, wearing garments selected by a stranger. You look around at the life you have painstakingly erected and ask a question you were previously forbidden from entertaining. Whose life is this? This is an immensely perilous question to ask. Not because its answer will shatter your mind, but because the answer inevitably implicates the people you love. It implies that the parent who sacrificed so much on your behalf did so while simultaneously shaping you into an instrument to repay a psychological debt you never contracted. It implies that the validation you spent your existence pursuing was never truly concerned with your authentic self. It was concerned with their own unlived potential, projected forward onto a child who was simply too young, too dependent, and too desperate for attachment to refuse the burden. Children almost never say no to those upon whom their survival depends. And so you said yes, repeatedly, in 1,000 imperceptible ways, until yes became the only structural response you knew how to offer the world. You said yes to the educational and career trajectory they envisioned for you. You said yes to the conventional markers of success that projected an image of prosperity during family gatherings. You said yes to the partner who fit the pre-established template, even while something quieter within your intuitive depths registered a profound discord for which you possessed no language. And here lies the psychological reality that is rarely articulated. Persisting in this unconditional compliance over a lifetime does not merely dictate your external choices. It fundamentally alters the landscape of your internal desires. You cease longing for what your true nature requires, and begin longing for what you were conditioned to desire, until the distinction between the two becomes utterly blurred. This is not a personal failure or a weakness of will. This is psychological conditioning operating precisely as it is designed to operate, quietly, invisibly, and continuously across years, until the original author of the conditioning is no longer required to be present. You execute the mandate upon yourself. You have internalized those external demands so completely that you now police your own authentic impulses before any outside authority has the opportunity to do so. You have become your own prison warden. Within my analytical framework, we observe how the layer of the psyche absorbs these external mandates and transforms them into an uncompromising internal law. It functions as a tyrannical shadow authority. What matters is not the precise academic terminology we assign to this mechanism, but the raw psychological process itself. A commanding internal voice forms during early development, constructed from every expectation, conditional gesture, and overt demand you ever absorbed. Critically, it articulates its commands in the first person. It whispers, "I must accomplish this. I am required to endure this. I am not permitted to desire that." And because it speaks using your own internal monologue and your own personal pronouns, you mistake this internal occupier for the core truth of who you are. It is not the truth of your being. It is an occupying psychological force, masterfully disguised as your own conscience. This is the exact threshold where your inner discomfort intensifies, because recognizing an occupying force requires you to confront how long you have mistaken its tyrannical commands for your own authentic free will. Consider every vocational decision made to appease a parent who could never truly be satisfied. simply because their dissatisfaction was never actually about your objective performance. Consider every romantic involvement maintained out of dutiful obligation rather than genuine affinity. Consider every false version of yourself you presented during holidays and family gatherings, where the collective gathered to admire the psychological product they had jointly manufactured. You were not raised in the sense of being allowed to organically unfurl. You were curated. And curated objects exist to serve an audience, not to experience their own autonomous existence. There is a specific relational dynamic that individuals rarely examine with sufficient rigor: the transaction between conditional affection and expectation. I am not referring to the elevated philosophical ideal of love, but the daily transactional currency that operates within families, institutions, and social circles without ever being explicitly named. It is the framework where warmth and approval arrive precisely on schedule whenever performance aligns with the collective script, and withdraws with equal predictability the moment performance falters. You comprehended this emotional economy long before you learned formal mathematics. You learned that an academic mark or a public achievement dictated the psychological climate of your home for days afterward. You learned that choosing a specific path could either secure a parent's fragile pride or detonate their emotional stability entirely. You learned that certain aspects of your temperament, certain unconventional desires, and certain authentic expressions were simply forbidden at the table. Consequently, you left those parts of your soul outside in the cold, much like leaving soiled boots at the threshold without ever being explicitly instructed to do so. No explicit command was necessary. The subtle shift in the emotional atmosphere was instruction enough. As life progresses, this pattern inevitably expands beyond the original domestic sphere. It was never confined solely to your parents. It becomes the template for all your worldly encounters. It manifests in the corporate authority who rewards your self-sacrificing overwork with superficial praise, while punishing your reasonable boundaries with cold detachment. It manifests in the partner who adores the accommodating version of you that requires nothing, but grows distant and defensive the moment you assert an authentic personal need. It manifests in friends who enjoy your unwavering reliability so long as you remain solid, but respond to your rare moments of genuine vulnerability with the acute discomfort of people whose expectations have been inconveniently disrupted. Society rarely informs you that it prefers your mask. It simply rewards the mask, penalizes its absence, and allows the consequences to enforce the rule. Most relationships do not terminate when mutual respect vanishes. They fracture when self-awareness dawns. Once you become cognizant of this transactional economy, you can no longer unsee its operations. You begin to detect it embedded within interactions that previously felt like simple affection. You begin to ask yourself, with a rising sense of quiet dread, whether anyone has ever truly loved the unfiltered truth of who you are, the self that exists prior to the commencement of the performance, or whether every bond you have constructed was merely a contract negotiated in your vulnerable childhood, renewed without your conscious consent every day since. This is the precise juncture where most human beings flinch and retreat into comfortable blindness. It is far easier to continue the performance than to sit with the agonizing possibility that your true self was never actually seen or valued. It is easier to keep acquiring external achievements than to confront the terrifying question of what happens to your intrinsic worth the moment you cease producing. It is easier to keep saying yes than to discover, through the simple act of uttering a courageous no, that much of the love you presume to be unconditional carried an exorbitant price tag all along. I have written throughout my life about a mandatory psychological death that must occur before true individuation and genuine transformation become possible. I do not speak of a literal, physical death, but the death of the false self, the persona constructed to appease an audience rather than to express the innate truth of the individual. This death is an absolute necessity, and it is invariably terrifying. The false self is not merely a costume you can casually remove at will. It is structural. Entire marriages, career trajectories, and family systems have been erected upon the fundamental assumption that you will continue to maintain this performance without end. When you remove the mask, you are not simply revealing a face. You are threatening the stability of an entire social ecosystem that was engineered around your self-effacement. This explains why the individuals who claim to love you most passionately will sometimes offer the fiercest resistance to your psychological growth. It is rarely born of conscious malice. It is born of structural dependency. They built their own emotional equilibrium around the predictable, compliant shape of who you agreed to be. When that shape begins to shift, when you tentatively begin to claim desires that were never officially sanctioned, the hostility or guilt you encounter is not truly about you. It is about the uncomfortable cost your transformation imposes upon them. This is the psychological truth that people struggle to speak aloud, so they allow it to fester beneath every difficult interaction instead. When you finally decide to set down the heavy expectations you were never meant to carry, you are not merely disappointing another human being. You are dismantling the comfortable role they relied upon you to fulfill. You destabilize the parent who needed your external success to validate their own sacrifices, the partner who needed your passivity to avoid confronting their own conflict, and the friend who needed your absolute predictability to avoid examining their own chaotic life. Your compliance was load-bearing for their identities. The moment you cease supplying that compliance, their internal architecture trembles. Rather than sitting with that discomfort and investigating what it reveals about their own unexamined lives, they project the discomfort outward onto you. Suddenly you are characterized as selfish, cold, unreasonable, or unacceptably altered. You are judged as having changed for the worse by those who derived quiet benefit from the self-denying version of you that asked for nothing. They will seldom articulate this with direct honesty. Instead, it arrives wrapped in the language of concern, in anxious inquiries about your well-being, or in nostalgic recollections of the person you used to be, delivered with just enough warmth to conceal its primary function: the re-establishment of control. People do not genuinely resent your personal growth. They resent what your growth exposes regarding their own stagnation. If you possess the capacity to transform, if you can step out of a role that no longer serves your soul, then the convenient excuse they have leaned upon for decades, the comfortable lie that human beings are incapable of fundamental change, collapses. Your awakening stands as quiet evidence against their own inertia, and evidence that implicates an unready mind rarely evokes gratitude, it evokes resistance. Here, the psychological weight reaches its most agonizing intensity because you begin to realize a truth that cannot be unlearned. The expectations you carried were never fundamentally about your personal potential. They were about other people's desperate need to see their own unlived lives realized through your existence. I have noted throughout my clinical work that nothing exerts a more potent psychological influence upon the developing mind of a child than the unlived life of the parent. It is not their articulate verbal instructions, nor their stated moral values, but their unlived life, the ambitions they quietly buried, the creative avenues they abandoned, the authentic identities they lacked the courage or opportunity to inhabit. That unlived life does not simply vanish into thin air when it is set aside. It remains active within the unconscious, seeking a surrogate vessel. And a child, vulnerable, desperate for attachment, biologically wired to secure the approval of those who provide shelter, serves as an extraordinarily receptive container. You did not choose to carry the weight of an ancestor's unfulfilled destiny. You were simply the nearest available vessel at the moment an unfulfilled adult needed a place to deposit what they could no longer bear to hold within themselves. This realization fundamentally reframes your entire personal history. The unrelenting pressure you experienced was never proof of your personal inadequacy. It was never a valid referendum on your ultimate worth. It was the unconscious transference of someone else's unresolved psychological material, delivered to you long before you possessed the cognitive capacity to understand what was occurring, let alone the boundaries to reject it. You spent decades believing you were failing to reach an elusive standard of perfection, when in truth, you were succeeding brilliantly at a tragic task, absorbing a burden that was never yours to bear. That is not failure. It is a form of unwitting, misplaced heroism performed by a young soul who did not yet realize the magnitude of what was being sacrificed. Yet comprehending this dynamic intellectually is not the same as allowing its reality to settle into the marrow of your bones. This is where many individuals halt their progress, mistaking intellectual insight for total psychological liberation. Insight merely illuminates the machinery. It does not instantly dismantle the habituated nervous system responses built over decades of living within that machinery. You can understand with absolute clarity that these expectations were externally imposed, and yet still experience an acute contraction in your chest the moment you displease someone. You can comprehend the entire structural genealogy of your inherited burdens, and still flinch at an authority figure's quiet disapproval precisely as you did at 8, 14, or 25 years of age. The human nervous system does not transform through intellectual comprehension alone. It transforms through repeated, lived experience. You possess a lifetime of felt experience, warning you that disappointing the collective is fraught with danger. That fear was not irrational. It was an accurate survival mechanism during your vulnerable early years. It has simply outlived its original utility. Now we must confront a deeply disturbing realization, one that demands a level of radical honesty most individuals evade for a lifetime. If your core expectations were installed rather than autonomously chosen, then significant portions of what you call your personality are not authentically yours. A substantial measure of your ambition is borrowed. A major portion of your terror of failure belongs to an ancestor's unspoken fear of insignificance, inherited and worn as though it were native to your own spirit. You have lived, in large part, as a psychological tenant occupying an identity whose blueprints were drafted before you possessed a voice. This does not mean your existence is a complete illusion. It means your essential task is to carefully separate what is genuinely native to your soul from what was merely handed down and left unexamined. Within my work, I have termed this critical process of self-differentiation individuation. It is vital that we distinguish individuation from mere adolescent rebellion. Rebellion remains bound to the very structure it opposes. It is inherently reactive, defined entirely by what it rejects, and therefore still dictated by the original authority. Individuation is vastly quieter, deeper, and infinitely more difficult. It requires you to sit in total stillness with a question that rebellion never pauses to ask. What do I actually desire when there is no audience left to observe me? Most human beings cannot answer this question honestly on their initial attempt. The habit of performing for an audience is so deeply ingrained that even in total solitude, you may find yourself calculating how a potential choice would be evaluated, whether it would yield approval, or how it fits into the narrative that others have written for you. The audience does not need to be physically present in the room to exert its dominion. You have constructed a permanent gallery for them inside your own mind. That internal gallery represents the unexamined shadow. It is not evil in a theatrical sense. It is simply the unintegrated presence of every mandate you absorbed so completely that you forgot it originated outside yourself. Confronting this shadow does not require aggressive self-flagellation. It requires precise, dispassionate naming every time it asserts control. The internal command, I must be met with the conscious question, whose voice is demanding this? The internal prohibition, I am not allowed, must be interrogated. Is this an absolute truth of my being, or merely an inherited rule I internalized? This labor of self-disentanglement is slow, unglamorous, and largely invisible to those around you. This invisibility constitutes its own unique form of grief, for you will receive no public accolades for performing the most formidable psychological work of your existence. There are no social ceremonies to celebrate the quiet laying down of an inherited burden. No crowd gathers to applaud the silent, solitary moment when you finally cease pursuing a form of approval that was never genuinely available on terms you could survive. You must perform this work in quiet isolation. That is not a flaw in the process of individuation. It is its very essence. What awaits you on the other side of that painful silence is not a grand, dramatic triumph. It is something far more durable, a life that finally belongs to the individual living it, regardless of how modest or unconventional that life may appear to external observers, and regardless of how far it diverges from the blueprint drawn for you before you had a voice. Claiming your life may result in a career that disappoints those who envisioned a more prestigious path for you. It may lead to the end of relationships that were maintained solely through your submissive compliance. It may require enduring years of distant misunderstanding from individuals who cannot forgive you for withdrawing the compliant persona they depended upon. None of these outcomes represent failure. They represent the necessary cost of living a life that is authentically chosen rather than passively inherited. The disorienting reality is that this cost was always going to be exacted by existence. Either you pay it now, consciously, with open eyes and a full comprehension of the stakes, or you pay it later, unconsciously, through the agonizing medium of a life quietly resented, a body slowly failing under the weight of chronic strain it was never designed to bear, and a true self so deeply buried beneath decades of performance that even you ultimately forget it ever existed. The psyche does not forgive perpetual self-betrayal. That which is denied conscious realization does not quietly dissolve. It operates from the shadows, resurfacing inevitably as neurosis, physical depletion, sudden psychological rupture, or a midlife crisis so severe that your artificial structures collapse under the strain. The weight you are asked to carry will not evaporate, simply because you refuse to look at it. It will wait patiently for the precise moment when your energy to maintain the facade is entirely exhausted. It is far better to set the burden down intentionally today than to be crushed beneath its weight tomorrow. This insight is not an invitation to harbor bitterness toward those who transferred this weight to your shoulders. The vast majority of them were merely repeating an unconscious pattern inflicted upon them by their predecessors, an unbroken chain of unlived lives searching for a vessel, stretching back through generations further than your family memory can trace. Harboring resentment keeps your psyche bound to them in a reactive state. What your soul truly requires is separation, a quiet, absolute separation not from genuine love, but from obligation disguised as love. The two are fundamentally incompatible, and confusing them is precisely how the burden is passed down from parent to child. You were handed a heavy legacy you never requested, and you bore it with a deep, heroic devotion that deserved to be honored, even if it was never recognized by those around you. That devotion was not wasted experience. It demonstrated the extraordinary strength of your spirit. That same devotion must now be redirected inward toward the construction of a life that is authentically your own. The most profound realization of all is not that the expectations were heavy or false. It is the discovery that you possess the immense strength to carry them for so long, and the even greater strength to finally recognize that you were never required to carry them at all.